Doug Anderson. Doug has been the executive director of PERA, I believe, since November of 2015. Doug, you can correct me, and he's worked in the private sector for quite a while before that. So he's very knowledgeable, very competent in what he does, and we've been working together on many issues and hope to work together again as time goes on. So now, Doug, if you'll take the phone, please, here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Leonard. Hope everyone can hear me okay. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with everyone today, and honored to be on the same agenda with Barb and Senator Dietzick. I think I have about 10 slides that I'm hoping can get pulled up. Here we go. Good. And I'd like to just walk through them and give you an update of where the plan's at, and to follow up a little bit on Barb's comments about the board's position regarding the investment return assumption and that process with the legislature and what that means. So I'm going to start here. Actually, the first two slides are what I presented to this group a little over a year ago. And I thought, since we do a lot of forecasting, it's only fair to go back sometimes and show what we're looking at and see whether, how accurate it is. So a year ago, at this time, we were working off of July 1, 2020 updates from our actuary. And at that time, the plan was about 80% funded. And if all the assumptions that the actuaries make were going to be met in the future, the plan was expected to show progress towards being fully funded by the year 2037. So at this time a year ago, it's like we're okay, but improving, and that's not a bad place to be, particularly given where the funds were back in the previous decade and all the work that was done to try to make sure that this line was going in the right direction. For a while, it was declining, and so there are a lot of changes, a lot of sacrifices made by a lot of the stakeholders to get this line going in the right direction. On the next slide, we just summarized that back in 2018, one of the changes that was made for this plan was to tie the annual retiree increase to inflation. Now, it was limited. It was limited in what we're able to do. It was limited by what the plan was viewed as being affordable at that time. So the annual increase was tied to inflation, but set at 50% of inflation. And this is the same index that Social Security uses. So when Social Security makes their announcement every October, we could look at what they provide and then provide 50% of that with a 1% minimum and a 1.5% maximum. So in 2019, the formula resulted in a cost of living increase of 1.4%. In 2020, it was 1%. In 2021, we were expecting it to be 1%, and it was 1%. And in 2022, it's the 1.5% maximum. So the concept and the goal of making this change is to connect it to inflation. It's this plan and the PERA correctional plan are the only two plans, statewide plans, that attempt to tie the increase to inflation. And the other goal was that this was desired to be a starting point, and that as the fund improves, we can work to change that 50% of inflation to move that higher, and to move the maximum higher as the fund can afford it. Now, the message a year ago was that the plan wasn't in a good position to work on those variables. The plan was 80% funded. It had a $5.5 billion unfunded liability. And the plan was looking like it was 20 years away from reducing that unfunded liability and reaching full funding. So having an unfunded liability means that the current benefits that are promised haven't been funded yet. So first we got to work to fund what's currently owed before we can kind of look at trying to change and increase the benefits. And then a year ago, we mentioned that there was the COLA study that Leonard and Dave Johnson talked about. Um, so that was what we talked about a year ago. It's been an interesting year. Positive in one very big and very real way is that the fund earned 30.3% on its assets. That's fantastic. It's the best return in a long time. Offsetting that to a point is the word, as Barb mentioned, from our actuaries about their concern about meeting the assumption in the future. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but this here shows a little bit the status of the plan and the money coming in and the money going out. This is the biggest plan in the state by far with the number of participants. Almost 150,000 active members coming in or active members contributing, and about 112,000 retirees collecting benefits. The contributions coming in are over $900 million a year. The benefit payments coming out are about 1.7 billion a year. So there's more money coming out to retirees than coming in from actives, but that's normal. That's expected. It's called negative cash flow, but it's not a concern because it's a mature plan. And that's why we work so hard to build up the assets in the plan. The bigger the amount of assets, the more the investment returns help to fill that gap and help to provide future benefits. And the investment returns did a nice job this past year, growing the assets from 22 billion up to 28.6 billion. So if we go on to the next page, this is another perspective of what the future of the plan looks like. So this is the expected benefit payments coming out of the plan for current members by year. So in 2022, the previous slide mentioned there was about 1.7 billion in retiree payments. That's expected to grow each year. The actuaries, this is just forecasting based on future retirements for active members and lifespans of all members. It doesn't include future hires. So it's just an idea of, well, what is the expected demand on the fund going forward? And it will increase over time. What's shown in the green, that's how much the current assets of the plan, how far they go to cover these benefit payments. So it's kind of a question of the 28.6 billion in assets. That's a big number, and that alone is enough to cover 13 years of payments. But all the payments after that needs to come from investment returns and employee and employer contributions. And so some of the concern is that our actuaries and who listen to investment consultants are kind of concerned about lower returns than what they're expecting in the future. But it really tries to point that we really need to rely on those investment returns. We need to keep the plan well funded. We need to keep contributions coming into the plan. That's a very important component. If we go on to the next slide, mention what the actuaries say. So the 2021 reports came with a disclaimer from the actuaries. And they rely on something they call the actuarial standards of practice. There's a lot of them. Standard of practice number 27 is all about the selection of economic assumptions. But really what they're saying is that when they issued the report, they said they're providing the results based on a 7.5% assumption because that's what the statutes require. But our actuary says that's not a reasonable assumption. And they provided us some guidance that in their opinion, they think a better assumption would be something ranging from 5.71 to 6.61%. So it's a pretty significant difference. That is and I admit it came as a surprise to me. The magnitude of it came as a surprise to me. As Leonard mentioned, I've worked as an actuary. My career as an actuary goes back 30 years, so I understand this stuff pretty well, but it doesn't mean I can't be surprised from time to time. And also meant that I looked hard at it. I looked hard to understand it, to make sure that I personally feel comfortable before recommending to our board the board position that we did. And then on the next page is just wanted to capture the process of where we are in the process of what goes into the setting the investment return assumption. So the process is the State Board of Investment, who by all accounts do a great job. They've invested well. They've given us good returns. Excellent work that they do. But they share the current investment allocation with our actuary. And then our actuary goes out to 12 or 13 different investment consulting firms to get their opinion. So actuaries are more experts on mortality and demographic changes. They rely on investment consultants for advice on what they think these investments will earn in the future. So they do that to develop a recommendation for PERA. Then PERA's board can consider that information, and PERA's board can choose to take a position, which then I go out and talk to the legislature, but ultimately the legislature sets the assumption. It's in the statutes. They make the decision. They will weigh what they hear from PERA's board, together with what they hear from the Minnesota State Retirement System, as well as from the Teachers Retirement Association and from the St. Paul Teachers Retirement Plan. And we have different opinions. So PERA's board has a position, and there's differences of opinion within PERA's board, as Barb mentioned. MSRS has taken a position to support 7%. And the Teachers Retirement Association yesterday did not take a specific position, which means they're really, by not having action, they're taking a position of staying with the 7.5%. So there's some different opinions there. And I think we may have lost the slideshow. So the PERA board position is that the legislature's assumption should be in the recommended range from our actuary at the time the legislature makes their decision. And that was intentional, because this is intended to be open-minded. We have the opinion from our actuary about what they think is what they're recommending. It's also different for what they say is reasonable too. So we're kind of mindful if there's new information that changes their recommendation, I want our board to be open to that. Based on what we know right now, it's 6.5%. But if something changes that, I think, I'd like to be able to have our board be able to look at that. One component of the assumption is inflation. And not inflation in terms of what it actually is right now, not the 5.8% or what you may have seen in the paper today, but the component is what the investment consultants think inflation will average in the future. And when PERA received their first recommendation, that assumption was 2.25%. Now it's gone a little higher, up to 2.5%. So I think that allows, with that new information, it allows our board to consider that and consider whether they want to shift their position up a little bit. So that's something, we'll come back in February. The board meets in February, and we'll talk about the new information, and we'll see if that changes what the board wants to do as far as what they should advocate to the legislature. The next slide. This is a look at, well, what are funds nationally doing? This has been a long-term trend. You know, in my 30 years of experience on this, the investment assumption has only gone down. It's typically been pretty gradual, but on the left-hand side, the red line is what it's a survey of 130 plans across the country, what the median assumption has been, and it's been going down from 8%. The median is currently at 7%. PERA, and more broadly, the Minnesota statewide plans, because we're typically in lockstep on what the assumption is in the statutes, has always kind of lagged behind what is happening nationally. The funds nationally are hearing the same messages that we're hearing from our actuary, is typically to move to be more conservative. And on the right, it's a little bit busy. The key point on the right is that just from the beginning of 2021, February 2021 to November of 2021, 34 of those 130 plans have lowered their assumption. No one is going higher. So it's kind of the national trend. Every fund gets their own advice. Every fund makes their own decision. But this is, I think, is helpful just to put in context of what's happening nationally. And then this is the final slide of what it means. So if the assumption remains at 7.5%, which is, again, what our actuary believes is not reasonable, but if it remains there, the fund is 98% funded as of July 1, 2021. So it improved from 80% a year ago up to 97.9%. Fantastic. I mean, that's great. The investment return was really good. If the assumption is changed to be more conservative, if it's changed to 6.5, now that changes how we measure the liabilities. The liability estimate goes up. It doesn't change the actual asset value. It doesn't change what the assets are going to earn in the future. It just changes our estimate of what we need to make those future payments. The funding ratio is at 87%. Still really good. So a year ago was 80%, actually 79. A year later, with a really good return, and if the assumption is moved to be more conservative, it still shows very good progress in the funding status of the plan. On the right, this shows when the plan is expected to reach 100% funded. So under the 7.5% assumption, it's almost there. In fact, it's expected to be there in about a year or two. If the assumption is lowered, the expectation is that it would take longer. It'd be 2039 is when it may happen. Any assumption in between here, you can interpolate results. So if, for example, if our actuary gives us a new recommendation, if PERA's board supports, say, 6 3/4, and if the legislature hears that and balances that with what they hear from MSRS and TRA, and if they choose 7%, well, then these measurements would be about halfway in between what we're seeing here. And then the one last component of this is something that I feel is concern, kind of unique for this plan, is it's hard to go out and get new contributions for a pension plan. That's a difficult thing. So when you have the opportunity to preserve existing contributions, that's something we want to do. And a concern that we would have is that if the assumption doesn't change, the plan within a year or two can become fully funded, and 1% of pay employer contribution would go away. So it triggers off when the plan is fully funded, and it doesn't trigger back on. So if the plan gets over 100%, then drops back down, that annual contribution, which is about $70 million a year, goes away and doesn't come back. And that's real money. And providing future increases to retirees is going to take real money. So that's just a bit of a concern about if the legislature delays action, it may trigger off a benefit, even though we don't, the actuaries don't feel like we're at a fully funded place. So I think that's where I was concluding. Thank you for letting me present where we're at. I'm happy to take any questions.